So, we're back, Baruch Hashem. This is the fifth one. Alan, do you remember what number this is? This is number 5. And we are back in the Kuzari. And the Rabbi is trying to explain what? What is that for?
Backup audio, innit?
Oh. He's trying to explain why we can't really fault the philosophers for their theological mistakes. So he says, look, the philosophers, you can't really complain to them, about them, because they are people who did not receive wisdom or religion from previous generations. We have in Judaism a tremendous advantage that we have been born to a very rich and deep tradition that goes back to Avraham Avinu. And it is being passed down generation to generation. And we certainly have sources going back thousands of years to show us what that transmission looked like. How was it done? And when you think about the transmission, maybe it's worth taking a little bit of a detour so that you're clear. So when we received the Torah on Har Sinai, the Kuzari is going to explain that we've received really 2 parts. The first part is the written text, which is what we have in shuls and synagogues and in a Bible. And then we receive the oral tradition, the oral Torah. And how is the oral Torah transmitted? And so at some point in Jewish history, the rabbis developed 2 methods of transmitting oral law. And they have 2 different names. One name is called Mishnah, and the other name is called Medrash. Okay? They're both methods of transmitting Torah Sheba'al Peh, methods of transmitting the oral law. So let's take Mishnah. So Mishnah really has 3 meanings. The first meaning is the method of transmission, how they transmitted the information. The second meaning is the piece that they're being transmitting. And thirdly, capital M, the collection of the little Mishnahs, called the Mishnah. Okay? And how does the Mishnah work? The Mishnah has a set formula usually. Rabbi X said in the name of Rabbi X, or Rabbi X said. Then you have a statement, and then you have maybe another rabbi said something else. Right? And if you look at Mishnahs, right, even Pirkei Avos, it follows that methodology. Usually Mishnah does not quote verses. It doesn't provide a source for what it says. It simply says this is what it is. The second method of transmitting information is called Midrash, Medrash. That word also means 3 things. It is the method of transmitting the information, the piece of information that is being transmitted. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, there's this Medrash that says, right? They're talking about little m, Medrash, a piece of information. And then you have the Midrash, capital M, the collection of all these little Midrashim in one collection that's called the Midrash. And we have the major collection, it's called Midrash Rabbah, the great Midrash, because it's voluminous, right? We have a lot of volumes of it. And Medrash doesn't work like Mishnah. Medrash is always tied to a pasuk. Always. Medrash brings a pasuk. and then it explains the pasuk. Many times by bringing a pasuk from the writings. They'll bring a pasuk from Proverbs. They'll bring a pasuk from Tehillim, from Psalms, in order to explain a pasuk in Exodus, in Shmois. That's how a medrash works. Okay? Now, the rabbis later on developed a third method, which is called in Hebrew Talmud, or in Aramaic called Gemara. It means the same thing, learning. Gemara is to learn. Talmud is to learn. And you have three meanings. It means the method. It means the piece of information. It's called Gemara. Oh, there's a Gemara that says exactly this. And then you have the Gemara, the Talmud. And Baruch Hashem, we have the Yerushalmi Talmud, and then we have the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, right?
There's also a Talmud.
Louder.
And there's also a Talmud.
A Talmud, that's the little one. Yeah, yeah,
Well, like as in like Talmudim.
yeah. No, that's Talmidim.
Oh, it's Talmud.
Not Talmudim, that's Talmidim, students you mean.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the method of Gemara is different than Medrash and Mishnah. The process, the way that Talmud works or Gemara works, is it brings a Mishnah and it asks, why does the Mishnah say what it says? My minana minimili. From where do we know this? From where do we know that? And it starts going sort of back and forth, and there is sort of this very interesting back and forth by various rabbinic authorities where they are transmitting to us what we would say oral Torah, but in the form of this back and forth dialogue and argument and different positions. That's essentially how we've been transmitted our religion. And how do we know what Judaism says? Because we were taught. And there's a great responsibility for us as a generation to transmit Judaism correctly to the next generation. So as somebody who teaches Torah, I'm not teaching you what my opinion is, because it doesn't matter what my opinion is. What is important is to transmit accurately what the Torah actually says to the next generation, so that when you take over and become the next generations of Jewish leaders, you will transmit Judaism the way that it's supposed to, and not some crooked form of Judaism that sometimes you hear. We inherited a Torah, a living Torah, that we have to learn its principles, and we have to transmit it to the next generation. So the Rabbi in the Kuzari says the Greeks didn't have that. They had to start fresh. They had to figure out, looking at the world and say, what's going on? Why is this happening? Why is that happening? And so he says, the Greeks did not have access to the inheritance of the Jewish people. They did not have it because the tradition passed from Adam HaRishon to Shem, Noah's son Shem. And from Shem, it transferred down to his descendants until it reached Avraham Avinu. And from Avraham Avinu, it went to Yitzchak. And from Yitzchak to Yaakov, and Yaakov to his sons, and his sons to the tribes. And from the tribes, right, when Moshe Rabbeinu showed up, they knew what he was talking about. Because they were transmitted the teachings of the Torah. They knew before the Torah was given about a Savior coming that's going to be redeeming them from slavery, taking them out of Egypt. Why? Because Yosef told them. And so we see that there is an inheritance that we've had, whereas the Greeks did not. And so, Says the Kuzari something very interesting. He says, wisdom reached the Greeks once they conquered the Persians. And the Persians had it from the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. Only then did the philosophers in Greece came to be known throughout the world. And then from there, once the Romans took over, he says there wasn't a single famous Greek philosopher after that. Which is kind of true. They had the golden age, and after that, it's pretty much, that's it. Except the guy that invented souvlaki. Don't write letters, please. Now, so the king says, but does that then, if they didn't have a Masorah, they didn't have a tradition, they didn't have this transmission of wisdom, does that mean that we should not listen or follow Aristotle? Since they are sort of developing their system on their own, does that mean necessarily that we shouldn't listen to them? So he says, correct, yes. He says, because Aristotle did not have a tradition, Aristotle had to exert himself in order to investigate the beginning of the world, and it was very difficult for him to conceive a world that doesn't have a beginning, that does have a beginning. And he could not rationalize a world that is not eternal. He could not. And he understood, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi here, that there's evidence, there are arguments to be made that the world is created, and there are arguments to be made that the world is eternal, but he decided on his own that the world is eternal. And he did not think that he needed to ask previous generations of how did human beings come to be. He simply said, I think it's like this, and that was the end of that. So he says, if a philosopher was a member of a nation where there's a valid transmission of information from generation to generation, and they're transmitting true opinions, then it would be very difficult to reject. But since he didn't, he went on his own and argued that the world is eternal. So he says, so if so, the king says, okay, if you have a rational proof for one position or the other, right? Let's say you have really two good arguments. One that argues the world is created, and the other one is that the world is eternal. How do you decide? What do you go with? How do you decide? So the rabbi says something very interesting. The rabbi says, is there a proof? Do you know what the difference between an argument and a proof? An argument is somebody that makes a case for a certain position, but it's not necessarily that you have to accept it. That is, you could argue against it. But a proof means it's done. Okay? Just for those of us who are watching on YouTube, those who are on the live studio audience should try to be on time. Otherwise, I'll have to mention your name in the video, and then it becomes, we'll have to video pan, show your face, and it'll be public shaming, ruin your shidduch operations.
What do you give brachas afterwards?
No? No. I'm not kissing you, Shmuel. Nice try. Excuse me. I don't know how that happened. Turn that off. I apologize. I've been teaching this year for 12 years. I don't know why somebody calls me at 3 o'clock. They know that 3 o'clock I'm napping. Like some of you. So says the Kuzari, there isn't a proof for one position or the other. There's evidence to argue for creation, and there's evidence to argue for the universe being eternal. But there is no proof that you could say this is it. Now he says, this is a very important line in the Kuzari, and it's often misunderstood. So let's read it carefully and discuss it, and hopefully we'll get the right idea. He says, God forbid that there should be something of the Torah that will go against witnessed testimony that was either seen eye to eye or was proven to be rationally true. This line is talking about one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy of religion. Not only Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam. What is the relationship between science and reason and Torah? And you really find three positions. I'm going to present maybe another one if we have time with regard to this question. The first position is if there's a contradiction between what science says and the Torah says. One opinion says throughout the Torah. That is called kfira, right? Rejection of the Torah means that's it. The reverse side is that when there's a contradiction between science and Torah, you throw out science. Well, that's not very smart either. Because whether you like it or not, gravity is not just a good idea, it's the law. You try to break the law of gravity, you're going to break something. And so, and if you have a toothache, right, you're going to trust the dentist who's using contemporary science to treat you. I hope. And so those two positions seem to be very problematic. There are people who hold these positions. There are. What the Kuzari and also the Rambam and the Moyer Nevuchim hold, that when there is an apparent, right, when it appears to be a contradiction between what is scientifically true and what the Torah says, it means you misunderstood the Torah. Because at the core of this position is that truth cannot contradict truth. The Kuzari here is explaining to us that reason, human reason, is a valid source of truth. It can certainly make mistakes, of course. But it could also lead us to what is verifiably true. And if so, if it appears to contradict the Torah, then that requires thinking caps by the long-bearded ones. Not the short-bearded ones who are keeping the sphera, but the long-bearded ones. Yes. Yes, sir. Eliyahu.
You answered the question.
Okay. So, now I mentioned there's a fourth mahalach that appears a little later in Jewish philosophy, whereas it's called the double truth theory. Okay? It's a little bit out there, but it says that science or reason and Torah are both true, but they're not talking about the same thing. For example, the Torah is not coming to teach science. That's not the purpose of the Torah. And therefore the Torah has nothing to do with science. The Torah is not a history book. The Torah is a moral teaching. It's coming to direct us towards what? To truth? To an extent. But the purpose of the Torah is to direct us to holiness. The purpose of a Jew is to live a holy life. That doesn't mean that you have to live contrary to the truth. No. But the goal is different. The goal is to live a life of holiness. I don't know if you've ever been to a philosophy department meeting, right? People who teach philosophy rarely live according to the teachings of the philosophy they teach. Rarely. I don't want to give examples. You never know where the videos...
Stoic.
Lots of different things, right? Ethics professors who are unethical, you know. But the whole purpose of a Jew is to live a life, a reflection of the holiness of the Torah, to imitate God. That's the goal of Judaism. And so, according to Yehuda Halevi, right here, the rabbi says, God forbid for anything in the Torah to be contrary to what we prove rationally. Okay? And he says, certainly the Torah talks about miracles. So you would say, how? Miracles don't go with science. Water doesn't split. Right? And so he says, it's true that the Torah has miracles that seem to be a change, a modification of the natural order. Whether the items were created specifically for this, or changing one thing to another. For example, with Moses' staff, remember? It turned into a serpent, right? And then turned back into a staff. That's changing from one substance to another. But all of this came for one reason. To tell us that the creator of the world created the world willfully. Because he wanted to. And he could do in his world whatever he wants. Which means, should God want, he could change the natural order. He could. Now, with regard to whether the universe is eternal or was created, he says this is very difficult to answer. It's very difficult. Now, you might say, why is it so difficult? The Torah tells you. He's speaking to the king about the philosopher. He's leaving the Torah out of it. He's saying, if we just looked at the evidence, the physical, natural evidence, he says this would be very difficult to argue for one side or the other. But he says, but we have two pieces of evidence that we rely on. Okay? So, okay, let's see what the pieces of evidence he has. One is that we have a received tradition going all the way to Adam HaRishon, from Noah to Moses, about what? That there is a prophetic teaching or witnessing that is as reliable as a philosophical or rational proof. That's what he's holding. Now, you could argue against this if you want and say, well, why are you using prophecy as evidence? But he's saying that the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu is more reliable than a philosophical or rational proof.
Why is that?
Because it cannot be faked. The giving of the Torah on Har Sinai, which is a mass religious experience, could not be faked. And that is the entire basis of the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. Once we've experienced Hashem, right, God on Har Sinai, from that point on, whatever Moshe Rabbeinu said, that was a done deal. Because we knew that God speaks to people. We experienced it. And we said, yes, you speak, we will listen to you. We don't want to hear God right now. It was way too much for us. It was too difficult of an experience. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbos says that their souls left their body. Then it was brought back, and then it left again. And they're like, listen, we just can't do this. The bodies flew.
It was like a psychedelic trip, kind of. You could say.
Oh, so nice. So there are people who want to argue that. Here's the interesting thing. Now, I'm not speaking out of experience, like you.
I have no experience.
But as the way that I understand, no two people have the identical psychedelic experience. Right, Yuda? It's like, I don't know. What?
Yes.
Yes? It's true or not true?
No, it is true.
It is true. Right? What?
Unless people are on the exact same vibe, and then unless people are really vibing, they're like vibing.
Okay.
They're on the
Thank you,
same
sir.
vibe.
Thank you. No wonder. I think let's put it this way. Let's hope that none of our viewers nor the people in this office, in this room know what I'm talking about. But that when I looked into this question, it was very obvious to me. The answers were that nobody has the same, and they all are reporting the same thing. They all saw the same thing, experienced the same thing. Okay. And so he says, if a person who believes in the Torah saw or was brought reliable, philosophical or rational proof or scientific evidence that there was pre-existent matter. This is a whole problem, an argument between Plato and Aristotle that the Kuzari brings, whether there's pre-existent matter or not. If you're interested in this, you can read a book called The Timaeus. Is it interesting? No. But if you want to, you can. If you read it? Good. So there, Plato argues for the creation out of a pre-existent matter. Aristotle argues in the Metaphysics, I think it's in book 12, he argues for the eternal nature of existence. So he says, if we had such evidence, we could hold that this world was created in time, but the fact that there were previous worlds is possible. It wouldn't affect us. That is, if, let's say, it turns out that we recognize that the universe, this is on its 7th cycle of 7,000 years, right? There were another 7,000 years before this. That is, the universe expanded, contracted, boom, and started again. Ma'anaf Kamina. We're on this part of we're on this type of the ride, right? So that we went on the ride and we got, okay. So the Kuzari says, if that turned out to be the case, it would not affect our emunah. Why? Because it would mean that this trip around, it started with Adam and Noah and the rest of the story. The fact that there was a previous existence should not affect us at all. Question.
So the Kuzari is not denying that. There could have been
Says could be,
there
but
could have been an additional Adam. Or an original, they called him maybe
Jeff.
Said Saddam.
What about Jeff?
Muhammad. I don't know.
What about Jeff? Why not Jeff?
Okay, Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
There could have been like a pre-Adam though. Wow.
Or he's not a pre-Adam. He was the Adam for them. Yeah. People just always ask, Rabbi, what if they're aliens? What would that do to the Torah? Let's say they were aliens. So what? Well, maybe they have their own Torah. Okay, so they have their own Torah. Well, wouldn't that ruin our Torah? Why? They can't put on tefillin. They don't have a head. They're like, we don't understand Hebrew. They don't speak Hebrew.
Does the Kuzari speak about the idea of like other dimensions?
Why don't we? We're going to talk about it. We'll get lat.
Not Kabbalistic.
Multiverse theory.
Yeah, multiverse, not Kabbalistic.
Multiverse theory.
Like the idea that like something's happening right below us and above us. You ever seen Interstellar?
Yeah, did you hear that? Did you hear what they said? When we do a video, there's no Q&A. It's not open mic. It's not a comedy hour. Okay. The king says, you know what? What you've explained to me so far is sufficient. And if we continue our discussion, continue learning together, then I will ask you to bring further evidence to explain these Torah sort of topics about the relationship of science and reason and Torah. But it says, but right now, continue your story and tell me the following. I want to understand the following question in Judaism, which is what? That the creator of bodies and spirits and souls and intellects and angels that is so transcendent. You know what transcendent means? Removed, above. That no intellect can conceive of God, and yet, and for sure not through any of the senses, and yet he has a connection with the lowest creature, this human being, who is made out of matter. Matter is putrid. And he says, now, the human body is a work of wonder. But so is an ant. So is a little animal. They're all works of. But why is it that you want to say that this deity, this God, has a connection to individuals? It's a good question, right? And why is he asking him this question? Because he's still dealing with his dream. What was his dream? The dream was that an angel comes to him and says to him, your actions are wrong, but your intention is good. Which means that there is something that God wants him to do differently. Which means God is communicating to him. And so he still is bugged about that piece of his experience. Where the philosopher told him that he's delusional, he's like, no, I know that what's happening. There's something here. So he says, the wisdom that is used to create an ant is the same wisdom. He says, if you connect it to a heavenly sphere or to a star, or to anyone, any being in the universe except for the Creator, it would be a big problem. Because he says that only God gives sustenance to each creature according to his needs. No more, no less. Everything that an ant needs to survive, it gets. Everything that the, what?
My room.
Your room. Great.
Mine.
Anything that we need, for example, we need a sense of smell, intelligence, right? Ability to feel, ability to touch, have a sense of touch. All those things we have. But then he says to him, but wait a minute, isn't that all nature? These limitations and everything that's getting, isn't that under the category of what we call nature? And not God? So the rabbi says, well, what do you think nature is? It says, well, nature is powers. Different powers in the world. We don't really know what it is. But the philosophers, the scientists, they know what it is. So the rabbi says, no. The way that they know something is not the way that we know something. There's a qualitative difference. The philosopher defined, which is Aristotle, defined nature as follows. It is the beginning of the cause by which something is moved, and moved by essential movement and not accidental movement, and for something to rest, and resting, essential rest and not accidental rest. Okay? Now, if you don't understand what this means, you just have to take Aristotle's physics. He's got a book called Physics. And in chapter 2, section 1, he brings that so you could read Aristotle and you will be able to look up all sorts of interpretations on that. But Aristotle provides a definition of nature. And so, the Kuzari says, the king, it seems like the philosopher is saying that whatever is moving by itself or resting by itself has a cause that affects it either to move or to rest. Okay? I'm going to give you a very simple example, Eliyahu. Simple example. We get hungry, correct? Then what do? We look for food. What do? We have to move towards where the food is. So, at Ohr Somayach, what do? Move for food. We go to the dining hall. We look, we smell, and what? And we take a plate, put it on a plate, and then eat. Correct? Now, same thing with an animal. They don't go to the dining hall, they just wait outside and go meow, meow, and students feed them.
Cats are really in charge.
Yeah, they tricked us. But there's something that causes us to act this way. What triggers our hunger? The body or the mind? A chemical in the brain.
Pain.
What is that chemical in the brain? Where's that coming from?
Glucose?
From Hashem.
Body needing energy.
The body needs energy?
The brain tells us the body.
It's what? An addiction. Food is an addiction.
Most of the time, yeah. It's a secretion from the endocrine system.
It's a relationship.
It's a relationship. To what? To a donut?
Yes.
It's a place to invest our Yetzer Hara. Eat.
So the rabbi says, this is what the philosopher meant. The philosopher says that nature means that there's a cause behind all of the changes that occur in the world. There's a cause. And one has to distinguish whether there's an essential cause or accidental cause. But he says all of these things that the philosophers discuss is really meant to impress people who listen to them. To think like, ooh, wow, so cool. But Lamaisa, says the rabbi, in fact, what we said is the correct answer. Okay? That really the only thing that philosophers recognize in nature is something called causality. There is a process of causation of this causing this, causing this, causing this, that is operational in nature. And they recognize that they discovered that. Great. Good. We know that if we take this particular piece of food, it'll have the following effect. And if you take that piece of it, it's going to have this effect. And if you do this, it's going to have this. And if the chain of events, okay, great. So now what? So the king says, okay, so I see that the philosophers misguided us to think as nature being a partner to God. There's nature, causation, and then there's God. Because they say nature is wise. You ever heard of Mother Nature? What Mother Nature? What are you talking about? Or nature. When animals die, what do they call nature? Does its course, runs its course, right? They have this. They reify, make this the concept of nature, which is simply causation in this case, to have some sort of an aura or an existence. But he says, according to them, you could also say nature creates. And the rabbi says, exactly. That's their whole problem. We will stop here and we'll continue tomorrow. Hashem. Thank you.